Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And again, we are in collaboration with the Bloody Scotland Book Festival, and I'm delighted and excited to be joined by the 5 shortlisted authors for this year's McIlvanney Prize, which is to decide the best Scottish crime book of the year. And they are D.V. Bishop with A Divine Fury. Hello, David.
Hi.
Chris Brookmyre with The Cracked Mirror. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
Val McDermid with Past Lying. Hello, Val.
Hi there.
Abir Mukherjee with Hunted. Hello, Abir.
Hi.
And Kim Sherwood with A Spy Like Me. Hello, Kim.
Hiya.
What I'd like to do before we get stuck into questions, if each of you could give listeners a brief synopsis of your novels, that would be great. And David, can we start with yourself?
Absolutely. So my novel, Divine Fury, is set in Renaissance Florence in the winter of 1539, and my detective is a man called Cesare Aldo, who investigates on behalf of the most feared and powerful criminal court in the city. And he discovers a body, a man strangled and his body left behind in the main piazza by Michelangelo's statue of David, and the body's being posed as if crucified. And the next morning, another body is found in a different piazza, laid out in the same way. So clearly there's a religious element to the killings. So Aldo's investigating, and there's a lot of jurisdictional conflict between the church and the state over who should be investigating this, who's responsible for finding out who's doing what to whom and why. And all the roads seem to lead towards a particular church where exorcisms take place in Florence. So that's the background for the story.
And it's part of an ongoing series, which we'll maybe talk about later on as well. And Chris, can you give us a brief synopsis of your novel, The Cracked Mirror?
Yeah, the elevator pitch is what would happen if Miss Marple had to work with Harry Bosch. And it's about a woman called Penny Coyne, who's in her 80s retired librarian in a wee Perthshire village, where despite it being quite a bucolic, peaceful wee place, there's an awful lot of murders, which she tends to solve. But then she gets invited to a wedding in Perthshire Hotel. She's slightly concerned about the fact that she doesn't recognise the people who are getting married, and concerned because she's been losing her memory. But she's still going to this wedding. And meanwhile, and this is where the readers will think it's a binding error, a few chapters into the book, there's a character called Johnny Hawk, who is your classic maverick LA detective, always in trouble with his captain. And he's asked to investigate a apparent suicide at a movie studio. And he's asked, because of a bit of political pressure, to investigate thoroughly, professionally, and discreetly. He manages 2 out of 3, gets himself suspended, but he thinks it's more than a suicide. He's got one lead, and that one lead is to a wedding at a Perthshire hotel. So that's where their paths cross. After that, it gets very complicated.
We'll talk a bit about that as well, definitely. Val, can you talk a bit about Past Lying?
Yeah, Past Lying features Karen Pirrie, my cold case detective based in Edinburgh. And it takes place in during COVID. So we're in lockdown, which gives everybody a bad time, including the police trying to do their job. And so Karen is in lockdown with her colleague Daisy, and they're all kind of like, we need something to do. They've taken a load of cold case data with them, but nothing's really moving until Jason, her other sidekick, gets a phone call from a friend of his who works in the National Library of Scotland. And just before the lockdown, she'd been going through a new archive of papers of a dead crime writer. And in this archive was an unfinished novel. And it appears to be a blueprint for the disappearance and murder of a student in Edinburgh. And it maps pretty well directly onto an actual disappearance about a year before. So Karen thinks, well, if nothing else, we can treat this like a training exercise. It's probably nothing, it's probably coincidence, probably rubbish. Let's just get on with treating it like a proper case. And so they do. And it goes off from there in several interesting directions. But it also takes us deep into the heart of the Scottish crime writing community. None of these people are real, by the way.
So
Is
you
that
see,
I get mentioned in that book?
You did get a mention. You're a real person, but you're not a suspect.
Oh no.
well, having read Chris's book, I'm not sure if he is a real person, but we'll maybe get on to that if that was the case. And I've never read a book set in COVID, I don't think, so that's interesting in itself. Abir, tell us about Hunted, if you wouldn't mind.
So, Hunted's a wee bit of a departure for me in that it's not set in the 20s. It's a thriller set in 2024 in the lead up to the US presidential election. A bomb goes off in a mall in LA, and the finger is pointed at Islamic extremists. And this throws two parents together, a white American woman called Carrie Taylor and a British Bangladeshi man called Sajid Khan. Both of their kids have gone missing. They've been radicalized, and these two parents set off on a journey to try and find their kids before their kids can commit the ultimate atrocity. It's basically a story of what do you do when your children become terrorists' greatest weapon. And really, it's a book about radicalization and the rise of populism and the things that parents will do for their kids. And there are a lot of explosions in it, which is, again, a departure for me. But it's a lot better than it was, thanks to certain authors, one of whom is on this call, and I'll tell you a wee bit about that later.
Oh, fantastic. And Kim, yourself, what can you tell us about A Spy Like Me?
A Spy Like Me is the second novel in the 00 series, which is a series of novels I was commissioned to write by the Ian Fleming family to expand the world of James Bond, introducing new 00 agents. So in the first novel, Double or Nothing, James Bond is missing. He's gone missing on a mission, and MI6 don't know if he's been captured or if he's been killed. And we meet these new 00 agents who are trying to find him, and they come across a vital clue at the end of the first book. Now, in A Spy Like Me, the second in the series, we open with a bomb going off at BBC new headquarters in London, and MI6 learn that they have 6 days to stop another deadly attack. So the 00 agents are sent to smash a smuggling ring that's funding terror. And as they go through people smugglers, diamond smugglers, art smugglers, they find themselves inching unexpectedly closer to Bond, James Bond.
Well, it's interesting, and I spoke to the debut prize shortlisted authors earlier, a couple of weeks ago. We spoke about the variety that seems to be in crime fiction at the moment in terms of themes and what we're looking at. And I think it's even more evident listening to just what you people have said about your own novels. David, your historical set in Florence. Chris, I was going to say cross genre because I don't know quite how else to kind of expand without giving things away. It really is something very, very different. Val, with yourself, setting in COVID, but also the latest in our long-running crime series. I think that's an interesting aspect too. And Abir, it sounds almost like a global political thriller. Is that a fair description?
I'm a politics nerd, so it is global.
Yeah, fantastic. And a 00, I didn't realize that there was this expansion of the Bond world, so I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that, Kim. But first of all, David, why did you want to write the Cesare Aldo mysteries? What was it about this time and place that you wanted to explore?
I've always been fascinated by the Renaissance because it's a point in time and history where sort of mankind rediscovers classics and classicism and the birth of humanism and great art and architecture and philosophy and science all sort of blossom through the patronage of a few rich families in Florence in particular. But of course, it's also the period that gives you Machiavelli's The Prince, which is basically the political backstabbing handbook, no matter whether you're in Washington or Westminster, that's been used for 500 years ever since. So you get the sort of great beauty and breakthroughs, and yet sort of how to stab your way to the top effectively. So the idea of a story set in that particular period I always found appealing. And then I found somebody's monograph, their dissertation from their PhD, and they talked about how the criminal justice system in late Renaissance Florence was roughly comparable to a modern police force. And that was the light bulb moment for me. I just went, so I could do a kind of police procedural in the midst of the Renaissance, and it would be historically accurate and credible. So that was the germ for telling these particular stories.
And does historical fiction kind of, as you say, you can refer it to the present day, but you don't have to deal with certain present day things that might, you know, I don't know, what is about historical fiction in particular that appeals to you?
I mean, it gives you the opportunity to talk about modern concerns, but you're using the past as a prism to look at those things. So the exorcisms in A Divine Fury, it's basically an allegory for conversion therapy, and why using a particular version of faith or a slightly warped version of faith to try and impose your will upon other people is not necessarily the best course of action. But I can do that in the past without me just climbing on my high horse and banging a drum against something. So that's my defense.
That's a very good one as well. Chris, with the Cracked Mirror, regular listeners will have heard you on the podcast previously talking about it, but I think it's worth reminding them why you wrote the Cracked Mirror and how the whole idea came about.
Yeah, it was came from my editor, not in the traditional sense of my editor commissioning a story. It was, he just tweeted that he'd love to publish a meta murder mystery, and this sort of appealed to me because I do like things like The Cabin in the Woods, or anything that plays with the tropes and conventions. But I was slightly apprehensive about the downside of very meta stuff to me is it can be quite emotionally sterile. And if I'm going to be spending the best part of a year working with characters, I really need to care about them. So I wasn't sure if I would proceed, but then I just had this vision, this image of St Mary Mead or a village like that, and a SWAT team descending on it with full Kevlar vests and Heckler Koch submachine guns, and this image of two worlds of crime fiction that don't normally get sort of compounded. And that just suddenly became an idea that was too much fun to resist. But I think what was crucial to me was that it wasn't to be pitting the cozy against the hard-boiled in a sort of competitive way. It was that I had to sort of celebrate what we love about both ends of the genre. And one side isn't regarded as more realistic than the other. It's trying to illustrate how we go to the hard-boiled and to the action movie for a comforting escape, just the same as we do go to the little quaint village for a cozy murder mystery. So it's about, to some extent, it's about our relationship with story, this novel, and how important story is, but also the implications of the story you tell of yourself bounds your identity. If you're starting to lose your memory, the implications for that are really quite dire.
And as you've been talking to people about it, it's been difficult to avoid spoilers, because when I want to talk to you about it, I found it difficult not to kind of bite my tongue, if you know what I mean.
Sort of, in that everyone who's been interviewing me or chairing me, I think, has said they're obviously terrified of saying something, but I do always point out that the big revelation in this book is after about 3/4, so there should be plenty to talk about prior to that point. But it's not so much, I suppose, this big revelation, but there's revelations subsequent to that as well. It's not, I don't think it's a book that's bounded upon or dependent upon the big revelation. I think the real joy in this book is the chemistry of pitting Penny alongside Johnny and playing with the two different ends of the crime fiction genre.
Because they are such different people to begin with, and then actually they realise that there's things about each other that can help them that they might originally have found difficult.
It's the classic buddy cop genre dynamic, whereby they don't get on, but they come to both realise that they need to become more like the other person in order to solve the mystery. But more importantly, the thing that the other person has is the thing that's missing from them.
Thanks very much. Val, I was interested in how you approach writing the next in a series of novels? Is it notably different to kind of standalone novels?
You start from a different place. I mean, you start right from the beginning. You've got a cast of characters that you've used before, so you know who they are and what they're capable of. So you have to tailor the story to suit their abilities and the things that they're bad at, as well as the things that they're good at. So in that sense, absolutely start with character, and the story has to revolve around them. And that's how I know it's a Karen Pirie story versus an Ali Burns story or a Tony and Carol story, because right from the beginning I understand who these people are and what this story is. With the standalone, it's a completely different process, because you have a clean sheet. You've got the story, and you start with story. For me, it's how it works. I start with story, and then I start figuring out what kind of person would do this. What kind of person would make this choice rather than that choice? So you come at it as it were, story first, character second. And then they both follow the same path. It sort of becomes that sort of loop where they all inform each other. Character informs story, informs character, informs story. But you have to have that starting point of knowing whose shoes you're in. But with returning characters as well, if you do it right, if you know at the start of a series that you're writing a series, you plant little acorns and hope that they'll grow into mighty oaks later on in the series. And sometimes that doesn't happen, and sometimes it does happen. And it only really it's difficult sometimes, because with most of my series, they started as a one-off. The Mermaid Singing, the first Tony and Carol novel, was intended as a standalone. The Karen Pirie started off as a small but crucial role in The Distant Echo, and then I came up with an idea for a story that involved a historic case, and I thought, oh, I've already got a historic detective in Fife, I'll just use her again, because that's fundamentally lazy. And so it doesn't always go the way you intend it to go. You have to just run with it, and that's kind of what happened with this book. I had this mad idea about this book inside a book, and ran with it.
And deciding to set it during COVID times, to me, that seems quite a challenge, was it?
It was quite challenging, because I had to think, what were we actually allowed to do? Think back to those days. And I talked to a couple of cops about how it affected them in terms of what they could do in terms of their work. Interviewing suspects is quite difficult in COVID, as you're supposed to keep a certain distance apart. And people were being brought into the police station. If you bring a suspect in or a witness in for questioning, you had to bring them in a patrol car, because they had the plastic screens between the front and the back. You couldn't just stick them in an unmarked car. There's all sorts of things that made life difficult. To get material from the National Library of Scotland, which in this book they needed to do, they had to make an arrangement with the librarian to have a secret meeting in the back street. Here, this carrier bag contains what you need to know, sort of thing. So it's almost like behaving like a spy thriller at times. But I think you can also make it work for you. And I wanted to. The previous Karen Pirie novel, Still Life, had ended just as COVID was something we were becoming aware of. So it made sense to me to write a book that I couldn't write at the time.
Yeah.
Because when we were in COVID, I couldn't write the book, because my books are all set in the here and now, one way or another. And in COVID, you didn't know from one day to the next what the here and now was going to be. You could write something and the world was in a different place tomorrow. You didn't know what Nicola Sturgeon was going to come to the podium and tell you the next day. And I felt it very insecure. And that's when I started writing the Ali Burns novels, because they're set in the past, a past that I know and I understand. But I wanted to come back to Karen and not just to pretend that COVID hadn't happened.
Which, I think a lot of people probably have done. Interesting to read it just for the fact that it seems like such a different time. Even though it was recent history, it's almost kind of completely different history. Abir, why did you want to write this kind of novel, this kind of thriller? What was it about this world that interested you?
Well, firstly, as like David, my background's in historical crime novels, and I'd written 5 of these in a row, and I wanted to try something different. Having said that, all of my novels, all of my work comes from a position of anger. It's basically me trying to get therapy for my issues. So I write about I'm from Hamilton, I'm not paying for therapy. So I try and write about things that are upsetting me. And the things that were upsetting me when I started writing this book, it was the rise of populism, in America, in Britain, in Europe, in India, and the radicalization of people who were helpless. At the same time, I wanted to talk about my own greatest fears, which is as a parent, not being able to protect my kids. And as I was writing this, I thought of my father because he'd written me a letter when I went off to university. And it was two sides. I think it encompassed the only sex education talk I ever got from my dad. And it was like point number 7, which was, don't do anything that I can't get you out of. And that was it. That was it, right? But looking back, that advice, that point stuck with me because, my greatest fear is that I won't be able to get my kids out of something they get themselves into. And when you come from my background, whenever there's a terrorist atrocity in the world, you really, the part of your brain prays that it's a white man that's done it, because that way there'll be thoughts and prayers and the world will go back to normal in 10 minutes. Whereas if it's a brown man, suddenly 1 billion people are seen as a proxy for this. And suddenly it becomes a wee bit easier to get a seat on the underground, but that's the only advantage. I've been stopped. I'm the only person I think that's ever been stopped by security at Stornoway Airport. I mean, for a random search, right? So a lot of this stuff comes out. A lot of this stuff I feed into the characters. So one of the main characters is a Bangladeshi Muslim man called Sajid, who comes to the UK in his 20s, looking for a new life, but he finds himself stifled. He finds himself in this community in the East End of London, which has very, very narrow parameters. They're caught between a past in Bangladesh, which doesn't exist anymore, and a present where they're cut off from the country they live in. And their kids, people who are second generation and third generation British people don't feel British. They're excluded. And when somebody says to them, you're one of us, come on, this is the right path for you, they're easily led. And, this was at the time when Shamima Begum was in the news a few years ago. And I thought, well, what does that do to the family? What does that do to the parents of these people? But radicalization isn't just about, Islamic terrorism. We're seeing it in America. We're seeing the rise of the far right. White American kids are being radicalized just as often. And so I wanted to look at both of those stories. So I've got this white American woman called Carrie and this British Bangladeshi man, and both of them are trying to find their kids who've been radicalized by, forces that are unscrupulous, but which we're seeing. The thing that gets me, so much of this book has come true this year already. There have been assassination attempts. We now have, a woman vice president running for the highest office, which wasn't the case when I started writing it. So I'm thinking my next book has to be about an author who wins the lottery.
Yeah, well, so this had to be written in the present day for the reasons that you explained. It couldn't have been, as David was talking about, looking at the modern day through the prism of history. It had to be right here and now. Yeah,
for me, for the first, I mean, as David said, we use the past as allegory for the present, but for this book, I really wanted to write it in the present because it's probably the biggest issue in my head right now. The problem was I'd never written a thriller before, and I didn't know how to do it. And it took me, 2.5 years, and about two years into it, I didn't know what I was doing. So I sent the manuscript to several other writers, including Auntie Val. And they all came back with most of them came back with nice words. And Auntie Val came back with 2 pages of change this, do that, do this, do this. I felt like I'd been mugged, right? But it was the most helpful advice I have had. And if the book is any good, so much of that is due to Auntie Val. And if it's not any good, it's because I didn't put in all the stuff that she told me to put in.
There you go. It's a very honest point to make. Kim, what's the background to you writing A Spy Like Me? How do you get to write 00 novels? I'm fascinated by that.
Well, I've been a James Bond fan all of my life, as you can probably see from this obsession behind me. And pretty much all of my life said to anyone who would listen, one day I want to be the first woman to write James Bond. And most people would laugh at that, which is really the reasonable response. But when I first had lunch with my agent, it was kind of our first meeting, and would I sign with her, that sort of thing. And she asked me what my career dreams and ambitions were. And I said, well, I want to write James Bond. And then she didn't laugh at me. So I thought, well, you know, I'll sign with this agent. And she remembered that I had said that. And fast forward a few years, Anthony Horowitz was kind of finished with his series, and the Flemings were looking for a new writer, and they wanted to go in a new direction. And my agent said to them, well, you know, maybe I have the writer for you. And my first novel had been really different. It's literary fiction about the impact of the Holocaust on 3 generations of a family. So it couldn't get more different, really. But they had read that and they'd liked it. And I think they saw something transferable in how I write characters and dialogue. And so my agent called me and said that the Ian Fleming family would like to talk to you about writing James Bond. And I said, that's a really cruel hoax to play. I don't know why you would mock me in that way. And then she reassured me it was real. So she said, can you send them some ideas? So I sent them a dissertation worth of ideas. And she said, can we send anything that really proves you're a fan? Because for them, it's really important that you have that passion. So luckily, my mum had kept this bit of homework that I'd done at school when I was 14. And our English teacher had asked us to write about an author that we admired. And I'd made this whole illustrated booklet on Ian Fleming. So I sent them my ideas. I sent them my homework. They liked both. And the whole thing kind of took off from there. So it's a lesson to say outlandish dreams out loud and do your homework.
It's a lovely advocacy of proud mums keeping all your stuff from when you
Yeah,
were...
never clear out the attic. That's the other lesson.
I'm going to ask a few questions now, and feel free, all of you, to jump in because they'll apply to all of you. The first one I want to ask, and Val, if you could answer this first, are prizes such as the McIlvanney Prize important in terms of publicising books?
Yeah, being involved in prizes is always something that really helps you. Whether you're shortlisted or whether you win it, it makes people notice you. Bookshops particularly notice you. They put you on their tables at the front of the shop. And readers notice. There's only a certain number of books you can read in a year. And you tend to think, oh, if that's on a prize shortlist, that's probably worth reading. I certainly found, I mean, it's nearly 30 years ago now, I can't believe it, when I won the Gold Dagger, that transformed my sales abroad, because a lot of foreign publishers back then didn't have ready access to good translation. So they didn't know if my books were any good or if they were rubbish. But when I won the Gold Dagger, it was like, aha, this must be quite good. And so my agent managed to make a lot of foreign sales off the back of that prize. So yeah, it does make a difference. It makes people notice you.
And is that the experience of the rest of you, that this has been a positive thing?
Yeah, my whole career really started with a prize. My first novel took me 7 years to write, and then when I sent it out to agents, I didn't get much of a response. There was silence, and I got really disheartened with it for a whole host of reasons. And my partner kept encouraging me to enter the Bath Novel Award, which is an international prize for unpublished manuscripts. And I kept saying no. And then the night of the deadline, he said to me, well, why don't you? And I said, well, I don't think I'll get anywhere. And he said, well, if that's the only reason, I really think you ought to try, and like walked me over to my computer, and I pressed send on the novel at 5 minutes to midnight. I'm told I'm their latest ever submission. And then I won the thing. So then the judge became my agent. So without the kind of light that prizes like the McIlvanney Prize shine, I don't think I'd have the career that I have. And this, for me, being on this shortlist feels so surreal. It feels like because this was my first, stepping into a new genre that I've loved all of my life, but had never published in before. So to be here feels kind of like an out-of-body experience. And it's also very exciting to learn that I'm Scottish, which as a Londoner, I hadn't realised. So I'm delighted by that development in my life as well.
Oh, you're welcome.
You have to support the football team now, and it's no laughing matter.
Oh no, I mean, I can't betray Arsenal. I can't. I mean, I'll be exercised by my family.
Yeah.
Although I've got Hibs, I can hear Hibs from my study, so I guess that's my Scottish. I can have a Scottish team and an English team, right?
Yeah,
That's my
absolutely.
Scottish team. Yeah.
Arsenal can be your wee team.
Yeah.
McDermid ladies is the first team, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Arsenal women have my heart, but yeah, your team will be my Scottish women's team.
Good.
And in terms of prizes, Chris, what's your experience of it? It's been a good development in terms of the book world?
Oh yeah. I think actually the proliferation of prizes reflects what a valuable tool it's been in terms of publicising, whether it's individual books or lists of books or genres, or even very importantly, sometimes prizes to publicise lesser appreciated areas of fiction, or indeed, like in case of the Women's Prize, pointing out that women also write books. So please, let's recognise that. So yeah, I don't really see any downside to it. I mean, I owe a great debt to the fact that when my first novel was published that year, the CWA decided that no novel that year was worthy of the Creasy Award for the debut. And a number of writers and critics, including, once again, Father McDermid, had kind of got together and said, this isn't right. And they came up with a replacement debut prize, the First Blood Award, which was awarded once and once only to my first novel. And it really did help put me on the map. It was nice that that put me on the map rather than everyone just talking about the book that started with a jobby and a mantelpiece.
So they retired the prize after you'd won it. Is that what you'd?
Well, I think they decided to start giving the Creasy again after being suitably embarrassed.
Those of us who had made the protest of putting together the First Blood Award managed to get the Crime Writers Association to revise the way they did the Creasy. So after that, that stayed the CWA award again.
And Abir, do you have any thoughts on prizes and being part of a list like this?
Yeah, well, just echoing what my colleagues have said. Like Kim, I wouldn't be a writer today if I hadn't won a prize. It was a crime writing prize in the Telegraph, of all places. I'm not proud, but if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have had the confidence to keep going. Maybe that would have been for the better. I don't know. But yeah, but prizes, they highlight books, but they also, if you win them or if you're on a shortlist, it can really boost your career from a point of view of, as Val said, foreign rights sales, but also press coverage, and it opens doors for you. You get conversations that you wouldn't otherwise have, whether it be with TV executives or press or foreign publishers. And I found that really, really useful, because you can bang your own drum all you like, and we're all very good at that because we're writers. But when you've got this sort of external validation, it sort of proves that, beyond sort of my own bullshit, there might be something more. Not much, but a wee bit more.
David, do you have anything to add? Do you agree with what people have said about the prizes in general?
I can only agree with everybody else. In my case, it was actually at Bloody Scotland, which of course is this weekend. I entered and won the Pitch Perfect contest back in 2018 with my first Cesare Aldo novel, which I hadn't finished at the time, but won the contest, and that led to me getting my agent Jenny Brown, who's sort of one of the great institutions of books and letters in Scotland. And led to my first publishing deal. So I owe an awful lot back to Bloody Scotland and that competition, and standing up for 3 minutes and trying to sum up a book, which is its own special hell, it has to be said.
It might be nice, David, if you spoke a bit more about Pitch Perfect, because there may be people listening that are not aware of it, and it really is. It can be a real help to debut writers.
Absolutely. So Pitch Perfect, it's usually run on the Sunday at Bloody Scotland, and they sift. A load of people will enter the 100-word pitch for their novel, and those are sifted by a series of judges, and then the top 8 are invited to come along to Stirling and present. So they stand up and they get 3 minutes to talk about their book in front of editors and agents and publishers from across the industry who have come up specially for the festival and to attend as part of Pitch Perfect. And the track record of people who have, not just people who have won Pitch Perfect, but people who've been highly commended or have just been amongst the final 8, So it's people like Joseph Knox, Susie Apsley, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember who last year's winners was, and the name is completely escaping me at the moment. But yeah, so Dr. Lucy Andrew, who was one of the finalists last year, they've just announced her 2-book deal off the back of that. And the person who was highly commended last year, Natalie, she signed a book deal within a week of Pitch Perfect.
Yeah.
So it's the track record of Pitch Perfect and the number of people that has got their start from Pitch Perfect is quite phenomenal. And that's unique to bloody Scotland, actually.
And that kind of brings me on to my next question. It seems to me from the outside that there's a real close crime writing community. Is that a correct assumption? And if that's the case, what are your experiences? Kim, let's start with you, since I think perhaps you're the most recent member of the community.
Yeah, when I first came to bloody Scotland with Double or Nothing and walked into the hotel and saw everybody in the bar, I thought, oh God, it's like the first day of school, except all the cool kids already know each other. It seems like the crime writing community, because I've got experience now of writing across literary fiction, historical fiction, crime fiction. My third novel was historical fiction. And it just seems like the crime writing community is so close and so supportive, and you see the same people on the circuit. And then within that, the James Bond community is its own kind of world, and the fans are so passionate, and the writers stay around. You know, it's like once you're in, you know, the mafia, the Fleming mafia. So the first time I met Anthony Horowitz and Charlie Higson, who I grew up reading, and you know, they were like my writing heroes growing up. I actually really embarrassed myself the first time I met Anthony Horowitz. It was at a film premiere for No Time to Die. They do a special premiere for the Fleming family, and they invite the writers. So we were at drinks beforehand at the I want to say the Royal Automotive Club, but that doesn't sound right, on the Mall. And it was this drinks reception, and my husband Nick was talking to somebody. I couldn't see who because they were standing with their back to me. I went over and Nick said, oh, Kim, this is Anthony. And it was Anthony Horowitz, and I've been so excited to meet him. And I looked up at him because he's so tall. I just looked up at him and went, wow. And then just didn't say anything else. And I just wish the floor would open around me. And then to make it better, I said, oh, sorry, but I guess you get that all the time. And then he went, no, not really. I thought, yeah, it's just getting a lot worse now. But he was very friendly and very gracious, and so was Charlie Higson. And we ended up huddled off in a corner, talking about how to invent Bond villains. And I thought, you know, if my 12-year-old self could see me now. So everybody's been incredibly welcoming, incredibly supportive. And it's really felt like a family that I feel lucky to be a part of.
I can. That does sound like a kind of dream of a conversation. Absolutely. And just to open it out to everyone else, what about the kind of idea of this community of crime writers? Is that a fair thing to say, that it is one which is supportive?
No, we all hate each other. No,
No, it's just you, Abir.
It's just me that hates everybody.
Just
Oh no, the
everybody.
other way around. No, it's the most wonderful community, I have to say. You know, when you, as Kim was saying, when you look at it from the outside, you're always sort of startled by it. You're always starstruck, and then when you meet these people, and people like Val and Chris, who, you know, when I started out, were megastars that we looked up to. The idea that these people would give you the time of day was amazing. But the fact that they would, you know, invite you into this circle was just, it was beyond your wildest dreams. But everybody is so warm and so friendly. Unlike romantic fiction writers, they'll scratch your eyes out. So be careful.
Good to know. Definitely good to know.
I think,
I think when I first became sort of part of the community, as it were, I was living in the north of England at the time, and I joined the northern chapter of the Crime Writers Association with people like Reginald Hill and Bob Barnard and Anne Cleves and Martin Edwards, and it was they were just so welcoming to me as a newbie, but sometimes you had sort of like strange encounters, like you meeting Anthony Horowitz. I remember the first time I met Ruth Rendell. And Ruth Rendell had been a hero of mine for years. And I was sort of completely tongue-tied and dumbstruck. And I started, once I'd said that I love your books, I think they're wonderful, I've read them all. What do you say then? So I said, when you've written as many books as you have, I suppose it gets easier. And she looked at me as if I was very slow and very stupid and said, no, dear, it gets harder. I didn't really understand it at the time, but I do now.
Can I just say, on that note of meeting your heroes and getting starstruck and saying stupid things, same thing happened to me when I met Val McDermid. I ran out of words to say, and I said, "You must come to dinner." And she said, "Yes." And suddenly I'm like, "Oh my God, I've got Val McDermid coming to dinner." And yeah, that was just, so we delegated the whole cooking to my mum because my wife was too scared to do it either, and I'm useless. So mum went off to Blackpool that day. So mum did all the cooking, went off to Blackpool, came back drunk with her kiss me quick hat on, and said, "What time's Val Dunican coming for dinner?" And yeah, the rest is history.
We're getting the importance of mums in the crime writing community, absolutely. And Chris, yourself, you've been around the community for a while, I guess we could say.
Yeah, I think the thing that always struck me though is that people are very supportive, mutually supportive, because first and foremost they're fans of crime fiction. They tend to be fans of each other's books. They're eager to hear what each other are doing next and for each other's books to come out. So I think that is what sort of defines people's relationships with each other. There isn't that same sense of, you sometimes hear about a greater sort of backstabbing atmosphere in certain other genres. And I think it's that because we know that there's not a finite number of book sales to be divided up, and we first and foremost, we just enjoy crime fiction and we get excited when we hear what our friends are cooking up next.
And I don't think it's getting to do with the number of books, though, Chris. I just think it's the sort of people who write crime just tend to be gregarious and quite sort of open and helpful. I just think that's what it is, rather than the size of the market.
And I think there's a technical point here. In order to write credible, authentic feeling books where terrible things happen to people, you have to explore your own soul. You have to explore your own experience of terrible things. You have to think about grief. You have to think about how you felt when you were in grief. What changed it? When did you come out of it? What was the thing that made the difference to you? And so we live the life examined. We're not sitting about angsting about things because we've actually dealt with them, reinvented them, put them in the books. Nobody recognizes them because we've transformed them in the crucible of imagination. And fine, we're sorted. We've dealt with it mentally, but we're actually quite strong mental health because we've dealt with these difficult things.
Ooh, I wish that was me.
We certainly don't put the pathetic into empathetic.
The perfect place to round things off. I could speak to you all for so much longer, but I realise the night is getting on. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me. Thank you to D.V. Bishop, Chris Brookmyre, Val McDermid, Abir Mukherjee and Kim Sherwood. All the very best to all of you in terms of the McIlvanney Prize for Bloody Scotland, which, as David said, begins this weekend, and for the future. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.